Hey everybody, welcome back to HomeRecordingMadeEasy.com and here on my YouTube channel. And in this video, I want to show you how you can use Studio One with your analog mixer, whether you're using something like a full inline console like I have here in SSL Origin, or whether you're just using a small desktop mixer, something like a Mackie mixer, any kind of analog mixing desk. A lot of you have asked me in comments of other videos, how do I hook up my mixer to Studio One? How do I get the audio out of Studio One into my mixer of choice? And then how do I use it getting it back into Studio One? And a lot of that has to do with the way you route stuff in Studio One, and I want to show you that today. But before we get to that, if you like what you see in this video, please consider subscribing and hit that subscribe button and also the notification bell so you know when I post new content. Also, if this is your first time here and you want to learn about recording, mixing, mastering, EQ, compression, and so much more, I want to give you a free mixing course. Go to HomeRecordingMadeEasy.com. Right on the home page is an orange button. Click on that button. It's my gift to you just for visiting HomeRecordingMadeEasy.com. And if you stick around till the end of the video, I'm going to give you another free gift. So make sure you stick around. So you are someone that works with Studio One and you want to know how to use an analog mixer with Studio One so you can get your hands off the mouse and keyboard and get back to touching some faders. Now, again, regardless of whether you have a big full inline console like I have here, a 32 channel SSL, or whether you have a small desktop mixer, it all kind of works the same way. The way you kind of hook it up and the way you route stuff in Studio One works the same way. So regardless of the mixer, that really doesn't matter. But the first thing we got to talk about is we have to talk about your audio interfaces, okay? So, for example, in this particular case, I'm using a 32 channel mixer, okay? So, when you're working in Studio One, and we're going to get to the routing in a few minutes here, we have to be able to get the audio tracks out of Studio One, right? Out of our audio interface, and we need to bring it onto our mixer so we can use our faders. And maybe your mixer has some EQ on it, maybe your mixer has some compression on it, or different types of effects, but we want to use the mixer to mix our song. And then as it comes, the audio goes out of the mixer, we want to bring it back into Studio One as a final mix so we can export that as an MP3 or a WAV file. So you have to get the audio out of Studio One. Okay, so step one is we have to look at our audio interfaces. What audio interfaces are we using? So the amount of outputs that you have on your audio interface, and your audio interface has to have line outputs, okay? So regardless of whether you're using a PRESONUS interface, or if you're using a universal audio interface, or a Focusrite interface, or an RME interface, or whoever else that you're using, you need to have an interface that has 1/4 inch or D-sub. Most of them will have 1/4 inch TRS line outputs, okay? And depending on the interface you have, will depend on how many line outputs that you have. In my particular case, I'm using a Universal Audio X16, and I have 3 of them, okay? Each one of my audio interfaces has 16 outputs on them, okay? This board is capable of doing up to 64 channels of mixdown. So you want to have however many faders you have, however many faders you're going to use, you need that amount of direct outputs on your audio interface. Does that make sense? So let's say, for example, you have a 16 channel analog mixer. Then you have to have an interface that has 16 outputs. So you can route your kick onto track 1, your snare onto track 2, your overheads on track 3, your guitars on track 4, etc., etc. Each one of those faders has to correspond with a direct output on your audio interface. So if you have 16 channels on your board that you want to mix with, you have to have 16 outputs. Now, most audio interfaces today will have usually anywhere from 4 outputs to 8 outputs. Some of the more higher end, like the Universal Audio X16, will have 16 outputs, but most of them have somewhere between 4 and 8. So let's say you're using something like, I don't know, we're talking about Studio One. So let's talk about PRESONUS. Let's say you're using a PRESONUS Studio 192 or one of the Quantums where you only have 8, I think those have 8 1/4 inch line outputs, okay? So in that particular example, if you have 8 outputs, mono outputs, we need 16. So what does that mean? You would need to have 2 audio interfaces that are daisy chained together. So the system, Studio One, sees it as one large interface, and that would give you your 16 outputs, okay? So step one is we got to look at our audio interface. How many channels do we have on our mixer that we want to use at mixdown? And how many line outputs are on our interface, okay? Once you have that figured out and you have dialed in, this is where we're going to jump into Studio One, and I'm going to show you my setup so you can see how it kind of works. So let's hunt on over here into Studio One and let's talk about this. So here's a session on the screen that has already been mixed. Okay, this is a final mix. If you want to see this mix that I did in real time from start to finish, and you want to see all the videos on how I mix this particular song, you want to head out to my YouTube channel, Mixing Music Analog. That's my YouTube channel where I do a lot of hybrid mixing. You can see this mix in real time. So click the link in the description box. You can go see those videos, okay? Now, this particular mix had way more than 32 channels. I have a 32 channel mixer. This had way more than 32 channels. And we'll talk about in another video, well, what do you do if you have 50 tracks, 50 audio tracks, but you only have 32 faders? Well, in that case, you have to combine, or what we call comp, in your DAW, and you have to combine things so you only use the amount of faders that you have on the board. So you'd have to scale down a 50 track song to 32 channels. And we'll do that in another video. But let's assume for a second that this session here only had 32 audio tracks. I have 32 channels here in front of me, okay? So once you have all your stuff imported into your system, the first thing we have to do is go into Studio One Preferences, and we need to set up our I/O. We have to set up our input and output matrix, okay? So we're gonna do that by going to Studio One Preferences, and it doesn't matter what version of Studio One you're using, it's all gonna be the same. Mac, PC makes no difference. So we're gonna go to the Audio Setup tab, and we're gonna go to Song Setup, and we're gonna go to the Outputs tab, okay? And as you'll see here, there are a lot of outputs here, okay? So once again, I have 3 universal audio interfaces, which gives me 16 channels of output on each one of those 3. So if you take 16 plus 16 is 32, plus 16 is 42, and if my math is correct, it would be 48 channels. So I have, with my 3 audio interfaces, the ability to have 48 different outputs. Now, I may only be using 32, but I have the ability to have 48. I'm actually using 32. I'm actually using 48 because 16 of my faders here are being used for reverbs, delays, parallel compression, and those sorts of things. And those are right here. I'll look into this camera. So this board has 32 long faders for audio tracks and has 32 short faders, smaller faders, for effects. And from channel 1 to channel 16 on my short faders, that's all my reverbs and delays up here, okay? And all my long faders where all my audio tracks come in. So that's where the number 48 comes from. I'm using 48 of the faders, therefore I have to have 48 outputs on my audio interfaces, right? So let's go back in here into Studio One. So if we come back in here, you'll see that I created on my Outputs tab, the first one is always set up by default, right? With Studio One, this is our main outputs, channels 1 and 2 on our audio interfaces, right? That's set up as default. But then you'll see all these different outputs that I created just by adding a mono or adding stereo. I have mono, a mixture of mono and stereo outputs, and I've labeled them all. So if we start across the top of this matrix here, okay, you'll see, once you get past channel 1 and 2, you'll see channel 3, 4, 5, 6, and you'll see that they're kind of labeled here, right? You'll see A line 3, I've labeled 1 and 2 already. Check 1 and 2, you'll see A line 5, A line 6, A line 7, A line 8, all the way up to A line 16. The letter A represents the first of my 3 audio interfaces, right? So we have an A interface, a B interface, and a C interface. A is the first 16 channels, okay? A line 16, and then the very next one is B line 1, B line 2, all the way through B line 16. See that over here? Up here, hopefully you can see that. And as I hover my mouse over it, it gets a little bit more clear. And then we have the letter C for the 3rd audio interface. And we're going to go C all the way up here to C line 16, okay? And then you can disregard all the virtual stuff here down at the end, okay? So we have 3 audio interfaces, A, B, and C. Each one of them have 16 outputs associated to them, okay? On my particular audio interface, it's not a 1/4 inch output for each one of these 48, okay? It's actually a D-sub connector. I'll try to throw an image on the screen, the back of the Apollo at some point in editing here. So it's basically a D-sub connector, and each one of those connections has 8 cables. So mine goes from D-sub actually to my board, my console is a D-sub connector as well. So each one of those cables really carries 8 channels. Does that make sense? Probably for most of you, yours will have a 1/4 inch output on your interface, and it'll plug into a 1/4 inch input on your console, on your mixer. But regardless of what it is, it's all the same. Whether you have a 1/4 inch connector, TRS, or whether you have a D-sub connector, it all works exactly the same way. So out of the back of the Apollos, my interfaces, I'm taking 16 out of those 3, 48 out, right? And those 48 outputs, those physical connections, are being plugged to the 48 inputs on my particular console, which is the SSL. Yours would be the same way. You would take, in our case, say you had 16 faders, you're going to have 16 outputs on your audio interface. Let's say they're 1/4 inch. Those 16 cables are going to plug into the inputs, the channel inputs of your particular mixer. And in this example, it would be 16. My example, it's 32. All those audio interfaces need to be interconnected together. So the system, Studio One, like in our case here, it sees it as one large audio interface. It doesn't see it as 3 individual interfaces. It sees it as one. And you say, well, how does it do that? With Universal Audio, they're daisy chained together with a Thunderbolt cable. So the first Apollo is plugged into the second Apollo, which is then plugged into the third Apollo via a Thunderbolt cable. And that allows Studio One to really kind of see it as one large unit, not 3 separate units. Your audio interfaces will all work the same way. That's one thing you want to make sure that you understand when you're choosing an audio interface, that you're going to have to daisy chain these together. How does that happen so you can see it as one large system? Once you've done that, Studio One will see it as one large system. So each one of my audio tracks, you can see that on the left-hand side, I've labeled them all. Okay, so let's say, for example, my first audio track is a kick drum. Well, the first audio track is channel 1, right? That is being routed out, line output channel 1. See that here? And that comes down to the console. Try to look into this camera here. Channel 1 comes out on the board here, okay, on the console. So channel 1 in Studio One is the kick drum. Goes out channel 1 output, because I've set it up that way. And then it comes to channel 1 on the desk, okay? And that's just how it keeps it all straight in your head. And that's how I would recommend you do it. Channel 1 to channel 1 to channel 1. Back into Studio One here, you'll see channel 2 is the snare track. That goes out line output 2 on the first interface, 1/4 inch, or in my case D-sub, out line 2, okay? Comes to line 2 on the console. Channel 3 is the hi-hats. It goes out line 3 of the first interface, comes in to the board on channel 3, fader number 3, and all the way down, and you can see them all. I labeled them all, 5, 6, 7. You can see all the tracks that I've labeled. Now, a lot of these are mono tracks for the drums, but when we get to something like we had some percussion, right here, we had an effects track that was stereo, wasn't mono. So therefore, instead of creating a mono track, I created a stereo track, channel 13, 14, right? So 13, 14 is output line 13 on my first audio interface, and output line 14, left, right, stereo, okay? That comes to channel 13, 14 on the console, okay? So what I suggest you would do if you were doing something like this, even if it's on a smaller scale, once you have your audio interfaces daisy chained together, assuming you had more than 8 faders, if you were only using an 8-channel mixer, you may only need 1 audio interface, and there's no daisy chaining of anything together. But regardless, however many line outputs you have on your audio interface, you want to make sure that you label your tracks when you create your outputs. And my recommendation would make sure that that channel number corresponds to what's physically on your mixer. That keeps everything nice and straight. So you go through and you create all your tracks. And we've done that. So here is our 32. Actually, we only used 31 of the 32 faders. This session only had 31 audio tracks, but put that aside. So that's why you only see 31 was the lead guitar. There was no audio track 32, so you don't need to worry about that. And then I also, like as I said, I'm using 16 channels on the short faders for my effects. Effects output 1 is a stereo track, and if I scroll over here across this matrix with my cursor, you'll see here it is line output 1 and 2 on the third audio interface, right? Audio face letter C, line 1 and 2, line 3 and 4, line 5 and 6, 7 and 8, 9 and 10, 11 and 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So here are my 16 outputs on my third audio interface, which are all reserved for the short faders, for my effects returns. You may not need that in your setup, but just explaining what it is to you. And those are, so instead we have 16 mono, or in our case, 8 stereo pairs. So I'm using 2 mono outs to create 1 stereo track, because typically your reverbs and delays would be stereo, right? Okay, if that's a little too confusing, don't worry, but that's what this represents, okay? So you need to have audio interfaces that give you the same amount of outputs that you have for channels on your mixer, regardless of what mixer you're using. You need to set up your output section in Studio One to correspond to each one of your audio tracks that's in your session, so it matches the channel number that's on the mixer. That's the way I would recommend that you do it. Once you've done that, okay, and you've created your output template or your output matrix here, you can cancel out of this. So I'm just going to hit OK. Now you come down to your audio tracks, and in Studio One, if you come over to the left-hand side of the console here, you see we have an inputs and an outputs button. If I click on outputs, look what happens. All of my outputs are now shown, and you may say, well, what is this, Dave? This is actually a representation of the screen that we just looked at, that large I/O matrix right here. Let me show it to you again if you're a little confused. Remember audio setup? Right here, that output tab represents this matrix that we just created for our session. That's what this represents. Okay, so you could see all your outputs right here, and they're all labeled just like I labeled them in our I/O matrix. So we have our kick on track 1, output 1, our snare on output 2, hats on output 3, etc., etc. So I'm going to close this output tab for a second. So now what you do is you have your audio track here, kick 1. Okay, let's say it's right here, the kick group. I actually had 3 kick tracks that I bust to a kick group. And if you look at the output of the kick group, what does it say? It says 1 kick. This is our outputs. So I'm routing our kick drum to the output number 1, right? Which is this output right here. And that, because it's physically plugged in to channel 1 on my console, that is coming in on the physical fader channel 1 on the mixer. Does that make sense? Okay. It may seem a little confusing if you've never dealt with it before, but just think about it. You have a physical cable going from channel 1 output on your audio interface to channel 1 input on your mixer. Okay. That's the connection, physical connection, regardless if it's a quarter inch or a D sub, channel 1 to channel 1, physically. Then in the software, you created an output for channel 1, and then you routed your kick drum to that output. So when that kick drum plays back, the audio is going out that physical connection that you made on channel 1 and is coming to the input connection that you made on your mixer. And then if you play back the audio, you'll be able to control the mix from the physical fader on your mixer. And that is exactly what you do for every single audio track that you have in your session. Every piece of audio, when you're using a mixer of any kind, no matter what it is, all the audio has to go out of the interface, go in through your mixer, and then it comes back into Studio One, which we'll talk about in a second. You can't leave any audio tracks behind and say, well, I have a 16-channel mixer, but my session is 24 tracks. What do I do with those extra 8 tracks? I don't have an output. That's where you have to combine things. Again, we can talk more in depth in another video, but just to show you quickly that concept, like I did here with my kick drums, you can see I have 3 kick drum tracks. I have a kick in, a kick sub, and a kick sample. Now, I couldn't just I could have routed that out, channel 1, channel 2, channel 3 on my audio interface, and I could have put those on 3 separate faders on the console. But because this session was much larger than 32 tracks, I had to combine a bunch of things and group a bunch of things so I didn't run out of faders, okay? So in this particular case, I took those 3 kick drum tracks, I blended them together in Studio One to get the balances. You can see the faders are not in the exact same position between all three. And then I sent that to a bus here in Studio One. And then that bus is what goes out the physical output. And now the kick drums, those three kick drums are only coming in on one physical fader. Okay, I hope that makes sense. And I did that with my snare. You can see I had 3 snare tracks, a snare top, a snare bottom, and a snare sample. So yes, I could have routed that out 3 separate outputs and put those on 3 separate faders on my console, but then I would have lost 3 faders. Instead, I decided to group them to a snare bus and then blend them in Studio One, the 3 snares, and bring the snare group or the snare bus to 1 fader on the board. So part of when you're working with an analog mixer, and every session is going to be different, you have to do a lot of setup work in that if your session has more audio than what you have physical faders, you have to do some combining or some comping inside of Studio One because you only have a limited amount of outputs, right? If you only have a 16-channel board and you only have 16 outputs, if the session is 40 tracks, you have to combine that, scale it down, eliminate tracks, whatever you need to do to make sure that you don't exceed 16. Does that make sense? That's why in this case I have a larger board, because most sessions are more than 16, 20 tracks, and I want to have enough audio tracks so I can spread out the mix as much as I can on the board. But if you have a large session, you do a lot of comping, a lot of combining, a lot of elimination. And again, if you want, leave comments below. I can do a video on exactly how I did that. I did do that video at Mixing Music Analog. If you want to click the link in the description box and see how I set this exact session up and how I combined everything, there is a video on that channel. You can check that out to give you a little bit more clarity. If you'd like me to do one here at Home Recording Made Easy, I can do that too. Just leave comments below and let me know. And if that's what you want, I'll take good care of you, okay? But there already is, this video is on Mixing Music Analog. So once you've done that, once you've created your outputs, you physically made the connections, the hard connections, you've done all your comping and all your routing in Studio One, and you've routed everything to all your outputs here. Now when you play back the audio, everything will come in on the board. So let me just show you a quick example of that, and then we'll send out this video. So if I just hit playback on this session, and I'll keep the audio turned down so you can't hear it, you'll just see the meters. So look at the meters. I played back the session, and here's the outputs. Here's all the audio going out of the outputs, right? So here's the audio tracks. We have a bunch of stuff that's combined or bussed or grouped. They're going out the outputs here, right? And if we look into this camera here, it's gonna be a lot of editing I'm gonna have to do. You can see the board, you can see my meter bridge. All those audio tracks are now coming in on the console, and I can mix all I want. And if I turned up the volume, you'll hear it, but I'm not going to do that. And all of my audio is coming out on the console, right? I'm mixing on the console. I'm not mixing in Studio One, with the exception of, let's go back to Studio One. The only place that I'm actually moving the faders in Studio One is if there are things like my kick or my snare where I have 3 tracks and I'm blending together to a bus. Then those faders are going to be a little different because I'm making a blend of 3 tracks into one. But if you look at the rest of the tracks, all the group tracks, all of my faders in Studio One are at 0 dB. Okay, and if you look at, let's say, all of my guitar tracks down here, they're all at 0 dB. Everything's at 0 dB, right? So if I'm not grouping things together or blending things together, I leave everything at 0, so it all comes into the mixer at the same level, and then I can use my mixer, look into this camera, I can use my mixer input or my trim level to adjust how hard I'm hitting the mixer. Again, that's for another video, but that's the concept, right? All the faders stay at 0 dB here, and you mix on your mixer. Now, when you're done and you say, yep, I got the mix, I got the balance, it's ready to rock and roll. Well, how do I get it back into Studio One? How do I make an MP3 out of that, Dave? It doesn't come out of the mixer as an MP3. Of course it doesn't. This is where you need to create what I call a print track, or somebody will call it a final mix track. I call it a print track, where now the final mix is coming out of your mixer and it's going back into Studio One, and we have to record that onto a track. Let me show you how to do that. So we're back here in Studio One. We're going to go back to the preferences window. And now we're going to go to the audio setup. And now instead of being on the output tab, we're going to be on the input tab. Okay, and you'll see I have a bunch of inputs. Now, the only one that I want you to pay attention to is the top one. The other ones are for different types of recording. Again, for another video. You don't need to do this. Just look at the top one. I created a stereo track called the print track. Okay. Just like you have to have your physical connections from your audio interface with the physical cables going into your desk or into your console or into your mixer, you also have to have the outputs of your mixer, the physical outputs, the hardwire connections, the final mix, your main outputs on your mixer or your console or whatever you're using. That left-right has to go back into your audio interface, right? Because on the audio interface, we have line outs going into the board, and then we have line ins going from the board back into the interface, right? It's a closed loop. It's got to go out the interface, into the hardware, out of the hardware, back into the interface. So out of my SSL or out of your mixer, you'll have a stereo left-right. That goes into two inputs on your audio interface. In my case, they happen to be line 3 and 4. Don't worry about it. Yours will probably be 1 and 2. So just like on the back of your audio interface, you'll have 8 or 16 line outs. You'll also usually have the same amount of line inputs. If you have 8 outputs on an audio interface, like a Studio 192, for example, or a Quantum or whatever, you'll have 8 inputs. Every interface will be a little different, but that's how it'll be. Usually the same amount of outputs are usually the same amount of inputs, typically speaking. You don't need to use all 8 or 16 or however many you have. You only need to use 2. In my case, I'm using 3 and 4. Okay, so you see how I created a stereo input, line 3 and 4? That's my input. Forget the other inputs for now. That's for a later video. In Studio One, what you do is you create what we call a print track. It's an audio track. Here it is right here in red. So that line 3, 4 is my print track. So what you do when you're done with your mix and all your faders are where you want them to be, you would arm this track, start from the beginning of the song, you hit playback, and what's going to happen, as a matter of fact, I'll do it for you right here. I'll show you. I won't save this session because this mix has already been done. Okay. Again, don't worry about all these other ones. Just worry about the print track here. I'll actually change the color so you can see it a little bit better. Maybe I'll change it to purple. There you go. Okay, so I'm going to record enable it. I don't want to mute it. And I want to turn on the monitor button because watch what happens when I play back the audio. If I just turn on the monitor button, watch what happens. Let me bring up the mixer here so you can see it, the console. Okay, let me make this a little larger so you can see it. And if I go to my inputs, remember we had an outputs tab we looked at earlier? We also have an inputs tab. And here's the input that I just created. Forget all these other ones, like I said, just look at 3, 4. Make it purple so you can see it better. Okay, so when I play back this audio, right now we're not record enabled, but if I play back the audio and I turn on the little monitor button, watch what happens. See how the audio's coming back in? This print track, because I turned on the monitor button, that print track is actually the final mix. And if you were to turn it up and listen to it, you would hear a stereo mix of the mix that you have on your mixer. You need to record that back into Studio One. So we're going to enable this, okay? Everything else is unmuted because we want to hear all the audio tracks. We want to hear the final mix. If I hit record down here in Studio One, watch what happens. Here we go. So now we're actually recording the actual mix that's coming out of the console. Again, look at this camera. You can see the meter bridge, all the audio's coming in. It's going back into Studio One, and now we are recording the final mix of all of your hardware processing, whether it's a mixer with hardware, or a combination of both. That's how it works. You have to let the song play from top to bottom or beginning to end in real time, record the whole mix in, right? Let's just stop this for a second. Now, let's say that was the final mix. Now what you do is you want to export this track, the final mix. You want to export that as an MP3. So you take off record enable, you solo this up, right? And then you just do your normal song export mix, not that. I did a save, sorry. Song export mix down, right? So we're going to go song export mix down. and you would do it exactly the same way you would always do it in Studio One. You're going to choose between your start and end marker at the beginning to the end of the song. Got to make sure your markers are set up. You could pick your format, your resolution, all that, where you want to save it, all of that stuff. But you export it exactly the same way. And when you export this track, because you soloed it, which means everything else will be muted, that is the track that you now can use on your website, email, or what have you. Okay, I hope that makes sense. I know it's a lot of information there. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. If you want me to make some more follow-up videos to be a little bit more clear, I would be happy to do so. So I want to thank you so much for watching this video. And to the people who have asked me about how do I use my analog mixer with Studio One, that is how you do it. And again, it doesn't matter whether you have a full console or whether you're just using a small little mixer. If it's analog, truly an analog mixer, and again, this is not like when you use a Studio Live. Okay, that's a digital mixer. That's a different video. This is for analog mixers, like a Mackie mixer or an Allen and Heath mixer or an SSL or an API or a Neve, anything that's truly analog, Tascam. This is how you do it. The connections may be a little bit different, but the routing and the fundamental philosophy of what I explained to you in this video is how you have to do it, right? Out of the interface with the audio, into your mixer, out of your mixer, back into Studio One, print it or record it on your print track, and that is your final mix. So I want to thank you so much for checking out this entire video. Now, like I said at the beginning of the video, I want to give you something else for free. So again, if you're new here, I want you to go to homerecordingmadeeasy.com. I want to give you that free mixing course. It's worth $100. Free mixing course, $100 course. It's my gift to you just for visiting homerecordingmadeeasy.com. And if you'd like that training course and you want to check out some of my other paid training courses, especially around the Studio One courses, I got tons of training on Studio One specific. I want to give you a 25% discount on any of the training courses on the website. Just use coupon code YouTube25 at checkout. That'll take 25% off any one of the courses. Okay, make sure you write that down, YouTube25. It'll be in the description box below. Check that out. And that's my gift to you as well. So I want to thank you so much for watching this video. Leave comments below. Let me know what you think. And I will see you guys in the next video. Take care, everybody.